Hey there, Steve here from ProgrammingMadeEasy.com, and today I've got a video for you that we're going to talk about team organization within enterprise. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off by transitioning over to my, oh, that's not the right one. There we go. There's my slide deck presentation. This is going to be another one of my, kind of presentations, slide deck things that I can do for a talk, either at like meetups or, conferences, that sort of thing. But I was going to just kind of put this up on my channel as one of those things that I think is really important for organizations, enterprise teams to kind of think about and consider when they're kind of building out their strategy. I think this is especially helpful for any new startup organizations or any enterprise organizations that are looking to convert to an agile ecosystem and kind of get off of the waterfallish style. So the title of this talk is called Evaluating Team Organization. It's an outside-the-box look at the box we're all inside of. I thought that was a nice little play on words. So just a quick overview here of what's going to be in this talk. First, we're going to talk about common team organizations, some of the more common ways that we see teams organized when it comes to the software development side of things. We're going to discuss a lot of the problems that we see with these organizational structures. I'm going to kind of propose to you the hypothesis, what I see is the root of those problems. And then I'm going to propose a solution that's somewhat controversial. Some of you who've watched this channel may know what that solution is. Those of you who have worked with me might even know what this solution is because I've probably talked to you about it a little bit. But then I also want to talk about the implications of implementing that solution. And then finally, we'll cover some of the more common objections that I definitely hear in regards to doing that particular solution. So let's talk first and foremost, just kind of set the stage here for what are the more common ways that enterprise organizations organize their teams. And the more common one that I think that is out there, I see this even in agile organizations, is this siloing of the teams based upon the skill or the architecture, right? So pair up the back-end developers, the Java developers together, and pair the React JavaScript developers together and the Angular developers together. And sometimes you might get a full stack developer, right? Or you might have a team that's full of full stack developers who work on everything. But by and large, it's kind of more or less organized according to these skills and the kind of part of the architecture of the project that they work on or the product that they work on. And so what ends up happening is if there's any particular story that is a shared story that impacts the customer, it's going to span across all of these different skills and disciplines. And since we structured the teams according to those skills and disciplines or architecture, it means that one shared story has to essentially cross through all of these different teams, right? So you have the inception team, whoever that inception team is, the group that acquires the requirements from the customer. And it may even be the business organization or the business operations altogether. They may be the ones incepting what the new next feature is to add. And then they may pass it along to a UX team who figures out what the interface should look like. They might do some wireframing or something like that for the actual end user. Then there's going to be some sort of front-end team that's going to go about the work of building out that front-end design. There's a back-end team, and these back-end teams could be split up even further, especially if you're doing like microservice architecture. You might have a lot of little tiny microservices and a lot of different teams working on those different microservices, but they're all kind of lumped together in this back-end team organizational structure. And then you have your DBAs, they're on one team, and you might again split up the DBAs into separate types of teams to handle different databases or different, again, domains. And then you might have a QA team that has to be contacted to validate that all of the changes that are being implemented by all of the upstream teams is not going to break anything. And then finally, some DevOps team that's going to be facilitating the deployment. They may be actively involved throughout this process. They may be someone that gets contacted or a team that gets contacted by some of the other teams to keep them involved and in the loop. But the bottom line is that one story that actually directly impacts the customer kind of crosses through a lot of these different boundaries. The exception being unless you have a full stack team that truly has full control and access to all of the parts of the code that they need in order to facilitate the implementation of what the customer wants. But that, by and large, is not the... I think some organizations are going that way. That's kind of one of the more common things that organizations are trying to get to. But this kind of structure of having some specialists based upon skills and architecture, that's kind of the more common solution, common scenario. One of the other ways that you will commonly find is domain-based organizations. So now teams are siloed according to the domains that they manage. So once again, you might have a shared story, though, that crosses a lot of these different domains. Like you might have a team in charge of the ordering process and another team that's in charge of the services that handle the inventory, and another team that handles the interface for shipping and accounting and billing and merchant services and vendors, right? We have all these different teams trying to handle all these different little domains. And you can have sometimes, quite often the stories that these different domain entities, these different domain teams get is very specific. It's very tailored to that domain, right? I need to do something for my accounting software. I need to do something for my billing software, that sort of thing. So in a lot of ways, this makes a lot of sense. And so organizations and enterprises are going to this way. But there are quite often several stories that do span across all of these things. And if you think about just if you were ordering something off of Amazon, it's going to cross all of these domains, right? It's going to cross over from the ordering screen to managing inventory to the shipping process to, tracking the accounting of all of the purchases and billing that has to go out for accounting. And speaking of billing, that's probably something else. You're talking about maybe managing which of the merchant services that you talk to, or how are you going to be doing invoicing, that sort of thing. Merchant services is, of course, trying to tie in some sort of something to some sort of credit card processing system. And then, of course, there are the vendors who you might have to reorder stock from, or maybe instead of storing in inventory, you just are kind of this middle person like Amazon, where the order actually goes sometimes directly to the vendor. I'm not entirely sure exactly how Amazon structures their domains. I don't know if they stock up on inventory regularly or if they just pass some of those things to vendors. I think it's an intermix of both. But the bottom line is, all of one activity that the user may want to have with the product may touch on several of these domains. If not all of them, it may be several of them, because a lot of them are interconnected, right? Such as accounting, billing, and merchant services. Those all kind of have a bounded context, right? Same with ordering and inventory. Those two things kind of go together. I can't really order something that's not in inventory unless I'm getting it directly from the vendor. So there's a lot of things that kind of tie together, and you can get a story that crosses over many of these things. And the problems that arise from either of these two organizational structures are plenty, right? There's a lot of things that emerge as issues that the teams have to solve. And really, it's not even the teams, it's the organization as a whole. The enterprise has to solve these problems. And so there's way too many of them that I could possibly go through in this. And there are plenty of talks that are on, describing all of those problems. And there's plenty of research on it. But I do want to kind of go over a few of the more central points. That's things like the communication gaps between teams. That's probably the nastiest one, is how do you communicate this shared story between all of the teams? And we'll see that organizations don't do what would probably be the most obvious answer, which is to create some sort of story and then just pass that one story around to all the different teams. Quite often, the work gets broken up according to the architectural structure of the organization. And the you end up having a story per team, right? One story for each team that's involved, and then each team has to figure kind of, how do I take this story that I've been working and I know that it has to be thrown over the fence to the next team. I have to document that process. I have to document what I did. I have to document what I need them to do. Um, and it becomes a documentation nightmare, or the communication process. There's committees that have to be drawn together or meetings that have to be set up in order to bridge these gaps of communication. So there's a lot of problems that come just simply because there's a communication gap inherent in the fact that we have these divided up teams. There's also this slowness to the delivery time, and so we miss a lot of deadlines, right? We have a lot of, if you think about one of those shared stories that does cross over all those domains, because of the fact that there are these communication gaps, it takes a long time sometimes for a story to be worked from beginning to end in terms of from the customer perspective. From each team's perspective, they're all working on their piece just as fast as they can possibly get to it in terms of what makes sense, but the overall accumulation of that is much longer than what probably the customer had anticipated. Another problem that happens is there's a ton of management overhead, because with this management overhead, this requirement to cover all of these communication gaps and coordinate the effort of the teams. Quite often what the customer needs are gets kind of lost in this, because there's no direct communication with the customer, right? The developers are not talking directly to the customer. That hardly ever happens in the enterprise environment. It's pretty much non-existent. You have some sort of requirement that business thinks needs to happen in order to facilitate better functionality for the customer, but it's not really direct input from the customer to the developers. There's a lot of filtering that goes on, and trying to be business objectives that determine what the direction of those of the effort should be amongst all the different teams. So there's this big management apparatus to kind of control all of this, and to coordinate the efforts between all the different teams. And in that process, there's no direct communication with the customer. It's all just kind of playing telephone, right? The customer told the business that they want this thing, and then you have a whole series of management that kind of has to wrap their head around what the last person in the chain was saying the customer wanted. So, of course, this leads to story context degradation, right? The context of what that overall shared story is often degraded because the teams focus just strictly on their own technical problems that they're trying to deal with. And of course, this can lead to apathy towards the business goals, right? We see a lot of apathy amongst developers that, it's a very high turnover rate in the industry because we kind of grow unenamored with the goals that the business is trying to accomplish. Now, we may have some great bosses that definitely can help keep us around, but in terms of what the business goals are, we kind of tend to get a little dismissive of those things. And of course, this knowledge siloing, this is a big one here too. The fact that these teams, because they're structured according to skills, but there's this tribal knowledge thing that starts to happen within those little domains that these teams are working on. And so to bring on any new developer into those teams becomes a very steep learning curve, and the loss of any one individual on that team suddenly becomes very problematic to the progress of the team. The team really slows down the work that they can accomplish because of a loss of some of that tribal knowledge. And then it's hard to hire someone brand new and put them in that system so that they can be successful. It takes a long time to ramp up on gaining that tribal knowledge that the team has accumulated. And of course, there are many more problems than what I've stated here, but these are just kind of some of the highlights and some of the more impactful ones that I've definitely seen as I've worked with different teams and organizations. And just to kind of reiterate this, I like to give this little kind of breakdown of what communication looks like over the course of time as a result of having these teams organized according to anything. They can be according to their domain, or they can be according to their skill. So let's just kind of break this down into time as allotted for the effort that the team actually undergoes, and this kind of communication gap, the how long it takes for a story to get passed on from one team to another. So if we just kind of take a look at, let's just say we have this one shared user story that comes into our organization, and it goes through the inception process. The inception process takes place, and then whatever the notes were that they organized, the document needs to be generated, some set of artifacts that need to be passed along and relayed to the next team, which is of course going to be the UX team. Now, I want you to think about this green communication queue. There's no static amount of time. This could be anything from, the very next day they start working on it, but it could be several iterations, especially if the UX team is working in some sort of backlog and they have a lot of higher priority items. So that communication, what the inception team has devised may get thrown onto the pile of what UX needs to work on, but it's going to be a while before the UX team can actually get to it because they've already got a stack of work they've got to do. And they don't necessarily think maybe that this new thing has the priority or precedence of the things that they're currently working on. So that communication effort, that communication queue isn't just a matter of how do we document this thing and then transmit it over via email or Slack or whatever the communication process is, the Jira tickets, etc. That part alone obviously takes a long time of documenting the requirements, and then being able to communicate that to the next team that's going to utilize those requirements. That's just one piece of this. The other part is, the UX team is already working on stuff. They've got a whole buttload of things they got to do, and you're just throwing it on the pile, and who knows where that's going to land on their list of priorities. And this continues on through all of the different teams, right? Front end, back end, DBAs, QA side of things, all the way down to DevOps before we finally get to this point where it's done. So you have one deployment or one story that can take potentially years, potentially a very, very long. It may not even get done at all, right? We see a lot of things that just kind of fall off the plate because it doesn't fall high on the list of priorities for any one of these teams along the way. And so it just kind of sits there. And if the back end is working on just trying to keep the structure of the whole enterprise running, your new little feature that you want doesn't really take much priority because we got to keep the thing running and we got to keep the lights on in order for us to continue working. So you could have a very high priority thing that the business says we need this thing, but the back end or DBAs or any one of these pieces along the way may be so backlogged and have such a high priority thing just to keep things going that they decide, sorry, this new thing is just not going to work. But on average, we do find that about 1/6 of the time for any given story is really going to take is just going to be about this communication piece. And I do want you to think for just a moment if having a domain organization, right? Domain-based organization where teams are structured not according to their skills, but rather to the pieces of the product that they work on. Does it really solve this by doing that? And that's kind of the direction I see a lot of organizations going is, okay, we know that we're not supposed to do this skill-based team structure. Let's go to domain-based structure. And create cross-functional teams. You'll hear that a lot too, right? Cross-functional cross-functional teams is really kind of the word. There's a whole team approach is another one that I like to say. But cross-functional is the really kind of buzzword that's going around right now. And you build these teams that are capable of handling from beginning to end a story that comes into them, but it's still siloed according to the domain. Does that really solve this problem? Or do you see that there are still going to be communication queues like we were talking about earlier when we saw the shared story that goes across domains? We still have those communication gaps, right? So that's just one problem, right? The time to delivery is impeded, right? It's impinged upon because of the communication process. But there's another one that I talked about, which was the management, right? How much management has to be involved and is overhead to oversee these projects and do the coordination of things and to basically check off a lot of those check boxes to make sure teams are, on a certain schedule or are meeting certain requirements and standards that the organization puts in place for quality, right? So there's this big management apparatus that's in charge of monitoring the progress of the teams and the quality of the work that the teams are emitting. So you end up with systems like this, right? So this is just one example of a structure, a business structure. This is a very common one that we're seeing more and more in enterprise called SAFe. It's a very interesting system. It's gained a ton of traction, and I know you can't really see all of it because I'm kind of in the way there. Maybe let me just kind of hide my camera. There we go. Okay, so now you don't see my ugly mug anymore. You just see the graph. So I want you to look at this graph, and if you study it carefully and look over it, what I want you to do is try to see if you can find where the work is actually done in this enterprise organization. And you'll notice all of these concepts that you see on this board are structured around the development process, right? There's all sorts of things on here like epics and enablers and backlogs, but I want you to look at it carefully and tell me, where do you see the work being done? What is the process of the work? I'll give you just a few seconds here. Where is the work actually done? All right, are you ready for the big reveal? It's right there. There it is. Right? So we see this one tiny little word here called execute. Everything else is management. Right? That is a monstrous amount of effort in order to basically track and monitor the progress and monitor the quality of the execution. That is this tiny, tiny little piece of the actual overall effort, because there's so much management and oversight that has to happen to evaluate the progress of the execution. And the execution is really just a tiny, tiny little bit within this overall plan. And that seems backwards to me. That seems really, really backwards. That there is just this monstrous substructure of management to facilitate what is essentially this tiny little piece of actual execution. Now, I get it. I've worked with a lot of SAFe teams, and I understand why this is in place. There's a lot of, especially with regulatory type things, and it just adds a bit of safety and a feeling of command and control from the operation, from the organizational perspective. There's a process that makes sense. And companies like process, companies like assembly type of work, okay? Assembly processes with a lot of gates. But, when I look at this, I just see waterfall, right? When I see all of these different processes that are undergoing, I just see this kind of waterfallish system. It's the marker, right? When you see this much management overhead over one tiny little actual bit of execution, this just screams waterfall to me. So regardless of the fact that it says Agile on it, I have a lot of qualms with the way that SAFe kind of says that it's Agile. Just because you say Agile in the name doesn't make you Agile. I'm sorry to say that. That probably disappoints a lot of people. A lot of SAFe people who may be coming to watch this video are probably upset with me right now. But I think we all inherently know SAFe is understandable because organizations and businesses like it. But this is, if you don't take a moment to step back and look at how much organizational management there is to monitor and to monitor the quality and the progress of just this tiny little piece, it's really astounding. It really is astounding. Okay, so here is my hypothesis. Here's what I think the actual root of the problem truly is. Static teams are the culprit. Okay, static teams. And I want you to think about this and just, I understand that there's going to be this kind of reluctance initially to this idea. You're probably having a reaction of revulsion, I guess, or I don't know what the right term there would be, right? But there's this, what do you mean static teams are the culprit? We all work within static teams. We all have these teams that we stay together with. This is the way we've been doing business for ages, for decades. And I would say, actually, that's not entirely true. There's a lot of organizations that don't work in static teams. As a matter of fact, the company I work for, Galvanize, we don't work in static teams. We have a lot of development teams, and we have a lot of teachers. But in terms of the teaching and consultation work, we're not static. Who I'm working with with any given customer is going to change nearly every engagement. So static teams are not really that, they may be very common, but they're not unanimous. There's a lot of organizations and a lot of, thinking about, one of my favorite things to talk about is, there's a book here. Let me switch my camera back on. I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's this great book called Mythical Man Month. I have it right here. I always keep it on my desk. I don't know why. Maybe it's just because I always like to show it off. But he talks about this idea of the surgical model, the surgeon model, or surgery model. I'd have to look it up. Like surgical of some sorts. But you can imagine whenever there's some sort of surgery going on, you kind of have this structure where you have one surgeon who is surrounded by a team that is assembled to perform the surgery. And who that surgeon is working, there may be a lot of common people that surgeon works with. Maybe they really like working with certain individuals, certain nurses, certain assistants. But that team that they assemble is quite often just assembled kind of on the fly based upon availability and skill requirements. So if you take it beyond just the development and think about organizations in the enterprise that are not development based, you will find that there's a lot of these instances where teams are not actually static. They don't stay together for long periods of time. They're very short lived. So this is not actually all that controversial, except for in the software development domain for some reason. And I haven't truly been able to understand or rationalize this decision to stick to static teams. But hopefully I can start to dispel some of the concepts and maybe give some alternative ways that we don't have to remain static. So as a result of these static teams, right, information stays siloed except for the documentation, right? So I mean, the information that we accumulate while we're working as a static team really starts to take on that kind of tribal knowledge situation, except for the documents that we emit, right? So the management is constantly asking us to document everything we do so that someone else, when we have to hand it over to someone else, they can read the documentation, which of course is an absolute boring, awful process, right? Both to the person who has to write the documentation and the person who has to read it. Nobody wants to write or read the documentation. It's boring, and not only that, but the documentation becomes stale. It's again very difficult to consume, and it's very time consuming to both read and write. So it's really just not a good system. Yet it's kind of the only system that we currently have, right? Stories get broken into smaller task-based units that are disassociated with the customer. And I kind of talked about this a little bit before. That the stories, they go from this shared story that directly impacts what the customer wants, what the customer needs, and instead kind of get broken out. Once we have this team structure, that one piece of work actually gets broken out kind of into more smaller and smaller tasks that are handed off to the different individuals. And I think we kind of loosely label the overall shared story as something called a feature. And then that feature gets broken down into some sort of story, and then the story kind of gets distributed amongst all the different teams, or just simply tasks. They're just like technical tasks that the team has to do in order to facilitate the story from some other group upstream. But the problem is in all of that process, we're losing, again, focus on the customer, right? Since we're focused on the task at hand and implementing the actual software development stuff, the code and the architecture, or maybe we got to spin up some Docker containers or whatnot. Since we're so focused on those technical tasks, we often get disassociated from the customer or the consumer. We don't understand necessarily the business needs of why we're doing this piece. We may kind of at an ethereal higher level understand, oh yes, we're doing it for the betterment of the business, but the direct relationship between what I'm doing and the value to the consumer is really kind of lost in this process. So backlog prioritization is, of course, very different between teams, which delays delivery. I talked a little bit about that before. The focus on technical implementations and specs creates a very rigid communication structure that, again, excludes that business value, right? So we focus really kind of on my work becomes about how I communicate to others instead of about actually doing something. So I kind of get stuck in this mentality of writing and creating and documenting the specs, and I don't necessarily, in those specs, I'm not really including the business value or the consumer value. None of that really gets translated in those things, which is really kind of a different way of saying the same thing I just said before about stories getting broken into smaller tasks. And of course, tribal knowledge accumulates, which must be acquired by new hires, right? We talked a little bit about that. That's kind of frustrating. Management, and I know, again, I'm kind of in the way here, so let me just transition myself out. There we go. Management is in place to bridge the communication gaps between teams or business owners, and work becomes gated, right? We see this waterfall process creep into what is supposed to be an agile process. But management is, we have to put this larger and larger management. And when I say management, I don't just mean simply people. I mean things like, say Jira or Slack or even Zoom in some cases. The kind of the opposite, the tools, right? We talk about Agile is supposed to be about interactions with individuals. But the focus becomes more on processes and tools because we have static teams. It's almost a direct result of the fact that we have static teams. Because we have static teams, we have to have some way of bridging the communication gap. And in order to bridge that communication gap, we set up tools and processes. So we essentially negate the very purpose of Agile. We kind of go against the Agile manifesto inherently because we are in static teams. And this was kind of the realization that I came to as I was thinking about this, about the fact that there's so many tools that are coming out about how we as developers are supposed to be doing our jobs. We have all these different tools from Slack to Jira to GitHub project boards or Trello or even really well-known systems like Kanban boards. Which don't get me wrong, I like Kanban. It's really great agile philosophy that goes beyond just the fact that you have a Kanban board. There's more to it than that. But all of these different tools that we put in place are really just about bridging that communication gap, about how we communicate to others. And because we are split up into separate teams like this, working on what is essentially the same overall goal, it inherently forces us to emphasize processes and tools instead of the individuals and interactions. There are ways that we could fix that if we were to constantly cross teams over and bring people from one team into our team and vice versa. So we do kind of some swapping and trading of individuals between teams, but that typically isn't really a system that I see very often. It's sometimes one team will have a problem that they're struggling with and they will ask for some assistance, but this kind of consistent swapping of developers between teams is not very common. And so as a result, of course, we get the siloed knowledge. And of course, with siloed knowledge means we have to have these management pieces that come into play just to bridge those communication gaps. And we saw what that leads to with the SAFe, right? With SAFe, we see huge giant management systems get put in place just to solve this problem of bridging the communication gap between teams. And that the root of the problem is the fact that they are statically built teams that are siloed. That is the root problem. So, what's the solution to this? I've articulated a ton of problems. I've talked about how siloing of teams is really kind of the issue. We have this big management structure as a result of that. We've got a long delay in time. But Steve, that's enough of the problem. Tell me the solution. What are we supposed to do? Well, there's this concept, and there's been in terms of team organizations and structures, there has been this idea of task forces forever. Like this, for as long as we've had the idea of teams, we've had the idea of task forces. And task forces are an interesting way of organization because essentially they're meant to be short-term units that are formed and established to work on a single defined task or activity. So, if you think about task forces, a lot of people go immediately towards military, but task forces go far beyond military purposes. It's about having some sort of very well-crafted and defined goal that a group of people is formed around in order to accomplish that goal. Okay, so task forces have been around, and I would describe that the surgical model that Fred Brooks, again, said that we should all be moving to, or as a possible alternative model in Mythical Man Month, he was essentially articulating a task force, but he called it the surgical model. Okay, and that's kind of it, is this task force idea, short-term groups, short-term teams, very specific, detailed goals, right? Some sort of task that they have to accomplish. So again, they need to be short-lived. Teams should not last longer than a traditional iteration. So, I'm talking really short. 1 week, 2 weeks, really that time frame. That's how long they should be in existence. Now, that time can be somewhat dictated based upon, understand that I'm not tying the time that a task force should exist to an iteration. What I'm saying is it shouldn't be any longer than an iteration. A task force should only be together for as long as the task needs to be accomplished. Once the task is done, the team should not be around anymore. It should be disbanded, right? So very specific thing here. No longer than an iteration, but for however long it takes in order to accomplish the task. Whether it's 2 days, 1 day, or 2 full weeks. But it really shouldn't take any more than that, okay? If you're going to like a month, that's too long. The task that you have defined is not small enough, okay? They should also be cross-functional and based, and they should have both skill and domain-based composition. So once you identify a story, and we could talk a little bit about DDD and bounded contexts here, but essentially whenever you have a user story that has to cross over multiple domains, you can identify the different domains that need to be touched upon and the different skill sets that are required to touch on each one of those domains. And once you know those things, there's no reason you can't figure out who the people you need to put on your team are, right? You can assemble a team based upon those required skills and domain requirements, right? So at least one person should have the knowledge of each skill and each domain, right? And so you just compose the team, the task force, with those individuals required for this. You need to have clearly defined objectives. This is another very, very important thing to do. You have to, one of the things about task forces is they have to have a very single defined task or activity or goal, right? Some very limited scoped thing that they all kind of adhere to. And there's a really important reason that exists, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But it's very important that there is a clear purpose for the group, for the task force's existence. And the only way you can do that is if you clearly define those objectives. You keep very small and clear outcomes that the team needs to achieve at the end. And that's the whole definition of done, if you will, right? Like, when do we know when the task force is done? When all of these objectives are completed, okay? So it needs, but they need to be small. They can't be this big, large project-wide kind of thing that are very lofty, very specific things that the team needs to accomplish. And then finally, one of the really important things that you need to do is establish this process of a task force. It needs to be part of the culture. So the organization has to adopt it as the way that we work from now on, or the way that we will do our work as of this moment. We're no longer going to adhere to static teams. We are now a culture of task forces. Okay, and the knee-jerk reaction of this is typically, well, that means a lot of change. And yes, if your organization is already built around static teams, this will feel like a change. But if you make it a culture-wide, organization-wide initiative that we are no longer going to be in static teams, we're going to be doing task forces instead, then that becomes the way that they get accustomed to. That it's no longer a change because it's just the way that things work here. So the change would be going from task forces back to static teams. So you have to establish it as part of the culture that this is the way that we work, and then it's no longer a change. It's the way, it's the default way that we behave. It's the default way that work gets organized. So that's a very important thing that the enterprise has to take on, is that this is actually part of our culture now. It's not a change, unless you were already doing it in terms of static teams. That may initially seem like a change, but once the developers get accustomed to the system, then it's not a change anymore. It's the way that you work. And so it's really important that you kind of establish this as the way that the entire organization operates across all of the different development spectrum, right? Across all the domain stuff, for all the teams, like all the projects that are in operation. This is the way that we do it, okay? So what are the implications of switching over to a task force-based solution, right? A task force-based organization. So how does this solve the problems? Well, you can now you can size your task forces directly to the scope and the deadlines, right? One of the biggest problems that we face, and there's kind of this this well-known, I don't know what you call it, allegory. It's not really an allegory, but essentially every developer you add to, for every project that's in process, adding a new developer doubles the amount of time it's going to take to finish, right? So it just extends your deadline. Every new resource that you add to the team extends the deadline. But that only happens if the project is already ongoing, or if the team is already ongoing towards the deadline of this body of work. But if you front load as much as you can, if you front load the team with the amount of people and resources required to accomplish a very limited, very scoped set of tasks and objectives here, right? That's one other key important piece of this, is again, very clearly defined scoped objectives. But as long as it's narrowly focused, then it's much easier to assemble the team that you need and tie the size of the team according to the scope of what needs to be done and the deadline by which it needs to be accomplished, right? I can add more people to the team up front if I have more work that needs to be done within a shorter period of time. But I also need to make sure that I am limiting the scope of what the work is as best as I can, so that it doesn't become a project-wide type of thing. I'm not opening up the doors to, we have this big, giant new product that we're going to have, 100 individuals working on. That is not a properly scoped, sized, you can't call 100 people a task force. That just isn't going to work. You've got to be very narrowly focused and scoped. So, but you could still, this allows us to tie our resources, tie our people, the task force size, according to how urgently we need this thing done and how much of the work is necessary in order to get it done before that time period, before that deadline. The other thing that this does is it eliminates communication gaps, because one team will be focused on just doing this one story from beginning to end. So from you receive the customer requirements, and you immediately get to work from beginning to end, and you don't have to throw any piece over the fence to some other team, because you should be assembling these again as cross-functional teams. We talked about how if we looked at the cross-functional skill domain-based composition, at least one person should have the knowledge of each skill in each domain, right? So at least one person should know the domain and skill, right? So not just one person on the team, but I mean, it's not like we have one tech lead and everybody else doesn't know what's going on. It means that you have all of the people on the team know at least one piece of the domain and or skill that is required to accomplish it, right? So that's really important, because when we get to this communication gap, there aren't any, because all of the people that are relevant to accomplish the story are on the team and can work together in order to resolve any issues that arise during the building of the product, right? So, or the fulfillment of the objective. So you can eliminate those communication gaps because you have teams that are comprised of the skills and the domain knowledge that is required in order to accomplish the story from beginning to end, instead of breaking it up into smaller tasks. It also means that we're getting the fastest possible time to delivery, because we don't have any of those communication gaps, right? We don't have any throwing over the fence. We don't have to emit documentation. Heck, you don't even really need Jira to track it at this point, right? I mean, you can from a high level in terms of, business organization, understanding what the different teams are working on. But in terms of the team themselves, they don't need Jira in order to track this, or any sort of ticketing system to track what's going on. So they eliminate a lot of those artifacts that the team has to emit just so that management knows where they're at on things and can continuously coordinate. None of that is a concern anymore. And so all of that extra time dedicated towards communication between other teams, you don't have that anymore. And you get to the point where you are now the fastest possible time to delivery, because there's no impediments to their ability to do the delivery. All of the people that are necessary with the skills and the domain knowledge are there, and there's no communication gaps to block them. And there's no management requirements on top of them trying to facilitate the communication between all these teams. That's all management's trying to do, as well as quality, which we'll talk a little bit about that later too. But you essentially eliminate all of the needs for that overhead of management and all the artifacts the team emits. So you don't have that excess amount of time that the team has to spend in doing all of those things, which means you get the fastest time to delivery. Okay, you have nothing impeding it. It's as fast as the team can possibly get through it. So tasks remain associated to a single story, right? So when a team gets the story, they're working it from beginning to end. So they understand the context. They know exactly what the purpose is of all of the pieces, all the little tiny tasks in between that they are themselves, kind of figuring out and accomplishing and doing. All those little pieces that would typically get broken up and handed off to different teams. Since it's all within the one team can easily identify how those things relate to the one story everybody's trying to work on, right? We have one goal, and I understand my part of achieving that goal. But now the goal is associated with the work that I'm doing directly, rather than as kind of this separated or segregated apportioned piecemeal type of situation that we typically see in organizations. Knowledge transfer is required with inter-skill dependent tasks, right? So because the teams are comprised of cross-functional teams, right, with all these different skills and different domain knowledge people, right, people that have some prior knowledge of the domain if that's necessary, all of now that knowledge that may have existed in one or two people's heads can be transferred to the rest of the team. The rest of the team now understands not just the context of the overall shared story, but all of the pieces that they may not have worked on in the past. They now see how to work on those things because they are working in conjunction with other folks on their team on those pieces. So the knowledge transfer just kind of inherently happens because of this interdependency of the team on other people in their team, in order to accomplish this singular goal, this one objective, this one kind of larger goal or set of objectives. And of course, there's no management required to communicate between teams. We talked about that, right? We don't need a giant management structure to manage the communication piece. That doesn't need to exist anymore, okay? Because there's no communication gaps to fill in. Business goals are going to remain associated with the stories. We kind of, again, talked about that a little bit where, tasks remain associated with a single story. Well, business goals are kind of a part of that. We can, again, see the overall achieved a goal that we are all trying to achieve, and we don't get disassociated with those business goals because we're the 10th team to work on this and all we have are specs, right? You get to that situation and you just don't understand the reason. We're just doing some work to do the work. And hopefully, maybe you have an architect that kind of gives you an idea of why your little piece is an important part. But in this system, if you're thinking about task forces that are getting kind of these shared stories directly assigned to them, there's none of that concern. We all know what the business goal is of this because we can understand how this impacts the user experience. So I do want to kind of go back to this graph, this little chart here. This was the old way. I just kind of put back up the graphic that showed the old way with the old effort and communication queue thing, right, where we have all these communication gaps. I just kind of want to illustrate this for you of exactly what's happening here now if you're doing a task force-based scenario. So now we get the user story that comes in. We have a little bit of effort, of course, to do some sort of inception process. Then we get the acceptance criteria, and then we can just pass that along to the team, and the team just works at it as one body. Right? And doesn't have any of the communication gaps. We've eliminated all that. So we've gained all of that. We've gained nearly 1/6 of our time back. So the time to delivery, right? I'm showing you how time to delivery has been reduced. We don't need it anymore, right? We can go almost directly from user story to done within the one team without communication gaps. There's no knowledge sharing that needs to occur outside of the team that's been assembled. So we get there's no communication queue. It's the quickest time to delivery. The context remains intact throughout the effort, and knowledge transfer is seamless, right? Because the team is working together on the same objectives. All right. So this leads me to you may be wondering, okay, great, Steve. So we want to do task forces. You've convinced me. Task forces are better. They're going to fix our time constraints. We're going to have better allocation of resources. You've got me. You've convinced me. But how do I structure my teams? How do I structure my organization? So that, or what is the process then? We saw SAFe with all of its processes and all its personnel. What is your process? What is your set of personnel? So that's where I came up with this idea. I call it Extreme Agile. I've also thought of something called, I've thought of task force driven development. That might be an alternative name, task force driven development. I'm open to ideas. I don't really have a great label for this, but I think Extreme Agile is a good label simply because it kind of combines a lot of my thinking and work that I've done with extreme programming and Agile teams. And it just kind of combines a lot of my thought and theory on this. So we start off with an inception process, which we have a tech lead that the tech lead kind of works with a domain expert. And for those of you who don't know what a domain expert is, that's kind of your customer, your immediate customer who actually interacts with the system. And you find out what their needs are. But you're wanting to find out, okay, who are the types of people that are going to be working with the system? What are the different ways they want to use the system? And then you can work off of those use cases to come up with user stories. And then you can kind of also work out a domain model of, okay, you kind of work out these different object models and the way that the domain is supposed to behave by talking to the domain expert, of kind of probing them for this information of how they want the system to be working. How do they perceive that it should behave? And actually, I'm going to take myself out of the picture again here because I think the graphic does get down in the corner a little bit. So we have tech leads, and this could be in combination with architects as well, kind of working together with the architect to figure out what that domain model should be. So it's kind of a work in progress where you decide what it is going to be built. Then you go to the organization phase. So we have this inception phase, then we go into the organization phase, where the tech lead, and it should be a tech lead, not the architect, but an actual tech lead, that determines the team size and composition based upon the required skills and time, right? So we can organize our teams now. We can say, okay, now that I know the size and scope of this one use case, this little body of work, these set of objectives that I have, now that I know that little tiny piece, I can identify the team members I need in order to accomplish it. So let's assemble the team. Let's organize the team. And of course, the team then receives the information in a refinement process where the team kind of looks over whatever the tech lead and the architect have put together for them and conveyed to them what the customer wants. And you go through and you kind of refine that. You refine the stories. You take whatever those things were that, the personas, the use cases, the stories that were incepted and looking at the domain model. And now the team can comprehend what the goal is that the tech lead and the architect have kind of devised for the team. And so the team goes about kind of refining that, just kind of inspecting it, looking, maybe we need to rewrite some of the stories so they make a bit more sense, or we can add some technical tasks to some of the stories that we need to do, and clearly define the acceptance criteria for when we know a story is accomplished, and kind of think about the workflow. That allows the team, this refinement process allows the team to thoroughly understand the challenge that is being presented to them, right? And understand what the goals are, the objectives are of the time that they're going to be working together. Then there is the building phase, which of course is where you do the development process. And then there may be a retro phase. This is always a good idea to kind of reflect on the team working process to see how did it go. Then after the team is done building and have done their retro, it is time to disband. Let the team go. The team is released back into the skills pool, right? The pool of talent that is available to the organization so that other projects can pick them up that need their skills or need their domain knowledge. And then there is this last phase that I also include in Extreme Agile called the education phase. So after a team has been disbanded, they may be kind of sitting in a purgatory of sorts, right? They're just kind of waiting for the next project or next thing to pick them up. And while they're doing that, they can do all sorts of different things to educate themselves. They can be doing spikes. They can be upskilling their skills. They could be learning new languages. They could even be doing conferences or going to conferences or doing internal conferences within the organization. Maybe the organization, the enterprise, can set up some sort of regular scheduled conferences for the developers to just kind of trickle into, or do video conferencing for some sort of conference. There's a lot of different opportunities here in the education phase while those developers are just kind of waiting for the next, the next set of objectives, right? The next team the next task force they need to be working with. They're just kind of sitting there waiting for that to happen. And while they're doing that, they can be upskilling. Okay. That's the general cycle of Extreme Agile. We have this inception process. After some bit of work has been incepted, we then organize the team and scope the size of the team according to the work that needs to be done and the time constraints on doing it. Then we go to the refinement phase, where once we've assembled the team, we then kind of present to them what the requirements are and let them refine and look over those requirements to come up with maybe the overall reflective strategy. And then they go about doing the building of the actual product. Then they go into a retro to kind of evaluate how they did and maybe improve upon this process in some way, or maybe some of the issues that they encounter. Maybe they even want to document that and come up with some action items for what they can do when they go into their education phase. Or what are another really good thing is when you're doing retro, kind of do a personal retro, not just a team retrospective, but a personal retrospective. What were some of the things that I didn't know going into this and I want to learn more about so that when I get into my education phase, I can go learn those things. All right. So, and then they go from that retro to actually disbanding. So we're done. We're ready to move on. And then we go into the education phase where we take any available time to just kind of soak up and learn new things. And maybe one of the goals of that our different developers have is to become a tech lead or an architect. And in order to do that, they need some time to go develop those skills, and the company can facilitate that during this education phase. So that's kind of the extreme agile model of how you can go about doing these kind of task force based teams in a cycle. But let's talk a little bit about the hierarchy then, because we saw with SAFe there's a lot of management to kind of do this development. And a lot of organizations try to get to a flattened hierarchy because it helps. Essentially, it gives the lower level teams, the developers that are actually doing the work, it gets them a little bit closer to the actual goals, right? By flattening the hierarchy, we get closer and lower level, and information can actually trickle up to the management a little bit faster that way too. It doesn't kind of go through 5 or 6 filters. It goes through maybe one manager directly to whoever cares about it. So flattened hierarchies are something that a lot of organizations are trying to achieve. And it's really a good strategy if you're trying to eliminate overhead costs and, I guess, management waste. And I don't just mean that in terms of, personnel, but again, those tools that are often used in order to manage the teams. So how does this flatten out the hierarchy? Well, if we look at just kind of, again, we have a domain expert that is the customer, right, or the business. And the business has this domain expert that has all of that needs something from the product. And they interact directly with some sort of management, okay? And that's going to be a tech lead and or an architect, probably both, or I'd say it's definitely the tech lead is really important. An architect can help inform what the tech lead needs to do, but the tech lead is really kind of the point person in terms of collecting those requirements from the domain expert. And sometimes what will happen here, what I kind of envision and want to expand upon is this idea of a management committee. It should be a committee that's deciding what the next thing is that needs to be worked. Right, so it's not just the business that says, "Hey, I want this thing done," but really the tech leads and the architects can look at it from a broader scope and understand some of the more low-level details of the project and the product, I should say, and understand what the projects are that are being undergone. And as a committee, the tech leads and the architects should decide what should be worked. Okay, it should be up to the tech leads and the architects determining this, and it shouldn't be just individuals making those decisions. It should be done by committee to come up with a consensus of what is the most important thing that needs to be worked on next. And that's how you do your what would typically be managed as a backlog prioritization from a product owner. Instead, it goes through a committee process where the tech leads and the architects take on both the business needs that they are accumulating from the domain experts, but also looking at the overall trajectory of the projects and the product that's being built. And they can come up with a general consensus of what is the most important thing that we can have our teams working on next. And then out of that, you then derive these skilled labor positions to handle all of the skilled needs for accomplishing a story. So directly underneath that tech lead that's going to be leading the effort to achieve those objectives, the tech lead will accumulate or grab the skilled labor that they need in terms of a QA representative if they want one, a DevOps person, or multiple people. Again, you could have more than one of these skilled laborers, right? You can have multiple QA, multiple DevOps, multiple UX, multiple developers, and multiple DBAs. But the idea is the tech lead only has directly under them these different skilled laborers, right? The developers, the DBA experts, the UX designers, the DevOps, the QA, etc. They are all directly reporting to the tech lead, and the tech lead is working in conjunction with other tech leads and architects to figure out what is the most important thing that these developers and the skilled labor can be working on. And that's how that's basically the extent of the hierarchy, right? You can have, I suppose, some management in here as well that's kind of monitoring the tech leads and the architects. You can have lead architects. You can have, this obviously doesn't show sales representatives or accountants or anything like that. This is really just focusing on the development process. But I think you can see that we've eliminated a ton of what we saw. And I'm just going to go back to, if you compare this hierarchy, this structure of who is doing what and who has what responsibilities to what we saw in, we gotta go way back here. There we go. Look at that. Look at that graph. Look at all of that extra management to cover one thing. That is a lot of management to deal with. What we've essentially boiled down to in this slide of only, this very thin set of layers for a hierarchy of responsibilities. So I think this is definitely going to achieve a lot more objectives. You're going to have more direct communication from the domain expert to the developers and that skilled labor. They're going to have really good idea of what the intentions are of the domain experts, because there's only one person that's kind of between that domain expert and the developer, and that's somebody that has a grasp of what the technical requirements are, right? That tech lead is going to know the overall direction of what the domain expert wants and knows what the skills are that are necessary, and be able to kind of bring this all together. And there can be an alternative tech lead, and maybe I'll put that on this graph at some other point, that you have a tech lead alternate in case that tech lead is out for vacation or whatnot, or maybe they're not as familiar with the domain and they need a little assistance on it, so they may bring in an assistant tech lead. That's always possible. But this is kind of just the overall structure. It's only 3 layers: the business, the management, and then the skilled labor. That's pretty flat, right? It's a pretty flat hierarchy. Okay, now I do want to talk about some of the common objections. So I think I've made the case pretty well about what the problems are with static teams. I think I've articulated that fairly completely. I've given you one of what I see as a possible solution to this, and it does mimic a lot of other organizations. Just for example, again, I like to bring up the one that I work for, Galvanize. It's very much structured very similar to how I just showed you. We do have some other individuals like engagement managers that help us kind of make sure that communication goes smoothly. They're kind of like a product owner in a way. But for the most part, it really is a lot of direct interaction between the organization and the instructors who deliver the content. So it very much mimics a lot of what you've seen on the slides. So this is not a far-fetched idea. This does exist. There are plenty of other ecosystems, maybe not development related, but there are plenty of other ecosystems that do have such a flattened hierarchy. So I've gone through all of that, but I do want to talk about some of the objections that I have heard to this idea. There's some really good ones, and I've had to do a lot of studying and research in order to kind of combat some of the more fundamental things that I think are out there that are almost in some ways misnomers. They're kind of, I wouldn't say they're myths, but they're just not necessarily accurate. So we have team cohesion is kind of a big one. And boy, I got to fix this slide because it needs to kind of go one at a time. But team cohesion is kind of one of the biggest objections I hear about, because there's this belief that's actually an incorrect belief that you develop team cohesion by keeping teams together for a long period of time. That is not entirely true. Team cohesion, there is a relationship between team cohesion and performance, but it is not the relationship most people think. And time does not develop cohesion. You can have cohesion happen very quickly under very specific circumstances. And we kind of, I do mention that a little bit later on in this slide, but one I do have some resources for each one of these things. So I do have marked on there. 75% of cross-functional teams are dysfunctional. That is a statistic that I pulled off of a Harvard Business Review study, and it was an article also posted by it's Benjamin Teresi from Harvard Business Review. He found I think it was something like 95 teams that they studied, and 75% of them were dysfunctional. So that's, if you just think that time is going to be the arbiter, or time is going to be the dictation of cohesion, there just isn't any data to necessarily support that. Cohesion can help. I'm sorry, time together can help with cohesion, but there is no direct relationship. Research also does show that narrowly scoped and interdependent goals leads to team cohesion. So it's kind of, that was what I was talking about before, how it's important the task forces are narrowly, their goals and their objectives are narrowly focused, is because that helps with team cohesion. And I have a couple of citations here. So one is team cohesion is an emergent affective state that is related to team performance, and that the relationship strengthens as team workflow demands increase interdependence and require greater coordination of information and effort. So as teams require more or have more interdependency, right? They need the skills of others on their team. That kind of inherently builds in this trust and need for cohesion. Okay. And another quote that I got was the cohesive performance effect is due primarily, and this is going to blow some people away here. The cohesive performance effect is due primarily to commitment to task rather than interpersonal attraction or group pride. So quite often we think about cohesion and we think about it as kind of this external force that's acting upon us, and if we have enough team builder exercises that will get better performance. That's just simply not the case. It is an effect due primarily to the commitment to a task, right? Having the group being committed to a task, which again goes back to it needs to be a fairly well-defined task that helps the team understand the overall goal and will lead to the cohesion of the group. It is not an external force acting upon the team. It is something that the team actually emits as part of the work that they do. It's kind of an inverse of what most people think of in terms of team cohesion. So team cohesion turns into groupthink over time, and that's another thing related to time. A lot of people, again, if we have teams, you want the highest performing teams or the ones stick together, and well, actually, what you get is a lot of groupthink with that, right? An inverse curvilinear relationship exists between social network measures, of which group cohesion is one. By the way, that parenthesis there is not something I've added. That was actually in the article. An inverse curvilinear relationship exists between social network measures, of which group cohesion is one, and team performance. What that means is, over time, the relationship actually gets inverted. So performance actually degrades over time. So I'm going to bring my camera back up here just to kind of illustrate. So you may have this kind of group performance that increases. Actually, I should go this way with it, so it looks right on my camera. Oops, I forgot to transition. There we go. So you may have, starting from over here, let's say that we're graphing performance over time. You may see performance go up like this incrementally, right, over time, but then there's a certain point where the team has been together for so long that they start to develop a group think, and so the efficiency actually, or I should say, really it's more about quality than anything else. The quality kind of starts to degrade, and so the performance actually decreases, and performance is related to quality because over time, this relates to technical debt too, right? Over time, the things that they kind of, since they didn't have outside objective looks at things and diversity of thought on things, and everybody kind of started thinking the same way about things, a lot of the little things that start to fall through the cracks that somebody else might have observed because they have a different perspective. If everybody on the team has the same perspective, you basically don't have any diversity anymore. And so a lot of the little things start to fall through the cracks, which actually degrades the performance because the team has to go back and fix the problems that they looked past as they grew more accustomed to doing things a very specific way. So it's actually curvilinear. It's inverse. So at some point, it starts to degrade, and you get diminished returns. Right? That's the theory of diminished returns. Okay, let me get myself back out of the picture here. So performance leads to cohesion, but cohesion does not lead to performance. This is statistically a true statement. A meta-analytic cross-lagged panel correlation analysis, which is a lot of jargon, but those of you who are interested in these types of things, it just basically means there was a study that was done on a list of studies, on a group of studies. So it's a study of studies, okay? Suggested that the most direct effect might be from performance to cohesiveness rather than cohesiveness to performance. So this was from Mullen B. Cooper C. So Mullen and Cooper back in '94 looked at the relationship between cohesiveness and performance, and they found that the opposite was true of what most people think, right? And that was, they looked at all of the different studies that were out there and did this kind of cross analysis of all of those different studies and found that the performance led to cohesiveness rather than cohesiveness leading to performance. So that whole idea of team cohesion, you really kind of have to throw it out of your mind. It doesn't really work the way you probably think it does. And that static teams developed cohesion. That is simply not true. There is no evidence to support that relationship. And in fact, we find that the exact opposite is true, especially when teams are stuck together for long enough periods of time. So it's really interesting. And this is all data and study and statistics backed. This is not something that I'm just kind of, it's something that I kind of thought about, and then I had to go and research because I was getting this objective. Well, what about team cohesion? And I started digging into the studies, and I realized, it's not what we all thought it was. Okay. So some more common objections, and I'm just going to kind of run through some of these. Domain knowledge is too spread out. So domain knowledge should factor into task force composition so the objection is, domain knowledge is too spread out, especially in large organizations where you have, thousands of people working for you. That's going to really spread the domain knowledge. That doesn't necessarily happen, or you can fix that essentially by having those tech leads, when they comprise the team, they need to be taking into account the domains that the domains that are being worked and the individuals that are available to work on those domains when they're doing the composition of the team. And what I would encourage a tech lead to do is to get kind of one person who you should bring on people who do not have domain specific knowledge. Okay, you should bring in people occasionally to work with those that do have domain knowledge, so that you can kind of slowly creep out some of that domain knowledge amongst other people. So we want to avoid siloing the information, but we don't need it to get big. It doesn't have to be big. We want to comprise our team of individuals who do understand the domain, and the tech leads are the ones that are going to know who those people are, because they just, they're working on a domain themselves. Tech leads are tied to the domain because they're tied to a domain expert. And that tech lead is going to know who the previous employees were that they worked with and bring on a lot of those same individuals. And I have another strategy for this. I have something called higher performance pair, and that's and something else I'm going to be releasing here at some point. Highly effective pairs are groups of team members that work very well together, that you identify as you're working with them, and you try to kind of keep them together in certain cases. You don't always keep them together, but especially when you have time-sensitive things, you can bring those individuals back together. But yeah, you definitely can keep the domain from spreading like wildfire. But even if you did, is it really a problem, right? Is having a lot of domain knowledge spread across the organization a bad thing? I would actually say that's not really a bad thing. It's kind of a feature, not a bug. Naming conventions, architectural guidelines, and assigning tech leads to fixed domains is really kind of the solution, right? Having these naming conventions that help us understand. So when a new developer encounters a domain they've never encountered before, they at least have some sort of convention that they are understanding, because company-wide we have this naming convention, or at least there's some way that they can access that naming convention to be able to look at the names and be able to look at and understand it. And then, of course, there can be architectural guidelines that are artifacts that can be emitted during the inception process, like, domain models, that sort of thing. All of those things can help the team understand, new employees understand what they need to get brushed up on. But also, they're going to be working with other individuals who do have domain knowledge, right? We talked about how we're going to comprise the team of individuals who have domain knowledge. So anybody who's new and doesn't have that knowledge is going to absorb it by working with those individuals who do have that knowledge. Okay, another objection I hear is there's not enough stability in these systems. I totally disagree. And again, that kind of goes back to the culture idea. As long as the organization has a culture of constant change, then it's not going to feel like it's change. It's going to just be the de facto way that you work. But also, humans are adaptable, right? I think we can't underestimate how quickly we can adapt to new systems. So stability is one thing, but I think that actually this leads to more excitement. This kind of model leads to new challenges that are more exciting to try to deal with and grapple with. So you're not it's not a drudgery. You're not dealing with the same thing day in, day out, over and over again with the same challenges. Instead, as a developer, you're being constantly challenged with new things to resolve. And I don't know of too many developers. There are some, but I don't know too many developers that don't like that idea of new challenges. There are some that are definitely out there, especially amongst the older generations. If you've got 30, 40 years of development under your belt, maybe you're not as excited about new things. But for newcomers to an organization, this is just an exciting adventure. Every new task force you get assigned to is an exciting endeavor. Another big one that I've heard is technical debt, and there's some other strategies I can't really go over in this talk, but the main thing that I think you need to consider about technical debt is that it accumulates when you don't have enough diversity. It accumulates from static, because we talked a little bit about how teams that are stuck together, they start to kind of let things fall through the cracks, and that's essentially what technical debt is. It's the stuff that falls through the cracks. It's the things that the team didn't address. But so as you have more teams working on the same domain, they're going to be looking at the past work and constantly be questioning it. Why did it go about this way? Or, hey, there's a new version of this. There's new technology that's out. We need to update this to the newer release of this library, right? All of that stuff, that's technical debt that just kind of sits there. And I think, in fact, what this system does is address technical debt directly. It actually embraces the idea of constant churn is going to force technical debt to get eliminated, because as each team goes through and looks at the code, they will constantly be challenging what past teams have done. And this does require a bit of, a bit of a culture shift that you may need to enforce with your teams. There's Uncle Bob famously calls it the Boy Scout rule, which is you always leave the code better than how you found it. Okay, so as long as every team, every task force that encounters this new body of work that they need to work on, as long as they approach it with, we're going to make it better than how we found it, you will not have technical debt. Because the system inherently eliminates it. Okay, so technical debt really does go away and keeps the code base in tip-top shape as, new individuals and new perspectives and new teams, new task forces look at the code. They're constantly going to refine it to make it better. And finally, the last objection that I want to talk about here is one that I've heard that from somebody that actually kind of had a similar organization. They said it didn't work in their organization, but there were some other mitigating factors. But I think it was a good challenge that they brought up, and that is that whenever you have, his idea was, or what he said his challenge was in the organization was, when a new task force was working on something, they were constantly asking past developers to come help them understand what's going on with the system. Okay, and what that actually screams to me is there were some practices that those teams weren't doing in the first place that would have solved those things. Things like proper. Actually, I have it actually listed here. So a focus on good naming, solid principles, and testing harnesses. Those things will eliminate that because if you name things correctly and you're using the solid principles, you are properly segmenting out the work so that it is easily consumable, right? Solid principles are not to make computers work better. They are to make humans be able to read the code better. That's what solid principles are for. It's about being able to reason the software better with fewer mistakes. That's what solid principles are for, is to help us humans digest the code we are reading. Okay, and that comes with good naming practices. So clean code, I should put clean code up on this list too. Clean code, good naming, solid principles, and having a testing harness around it to ensure that if anybody starts to tinker with the code and modify it in some way, the tests will break on them and they will be able to identify what they broke when they made that change. Those type of practices negate those challenges of needing someone to come help you understand and reason about the system. If it should be, it's really kind of a code smell, right? I don't know what the equivalent of this is, but if teams are constantly having to ask for past developers to come help them understand something, then that means that the way it was done in the first place was not very good. That's what this really means. The way it was originally done was not very good. Okay. And another thing that kind of negates this is having that tech lead that stays with the domain. So you still have at least one or two people, along with the composition of the team, right? We already talked about the tech lead is going to bring in domain people who have some sort of experience or understanding of the domain. They're going to bring them onto the team, but also the tech lead is tied directly to the customer. The domain expert. So the tech lead will have already worked with that domain expert to understand the overall system that's being worked on. And so those questions can be directed to the tech lead, and the tech lead is going to be working with the team, right? So the tech lead doesn't go anywhere. The tech lead actually works with the team on whatever that piece is. They're just as integrated. They may not do all of the development work. They may not have their hands on the keyboard, but they should be actively engaged with the team while they are doing the work. And as long as that is happening, then that domain knowledge can transfer from the tech lead to the new developers to that particular part of the domain. So yeah, mobbing I think is actually the best way to do all that. I think I've worked with a lot of groups doing pair programming, individual programming, working in groups of 3 and mobbing as an entire team. And I honestly think that just mobbing as a whole team is really one of the best, most effective ways that teams can work together. And it helps transfer knowledge between all of the individuals on the team kind of all at once and makes all communication synchronous. So that all of that kind of solves that need for knowledge transfer from any past developers. So there you go. That's kind of it in a nutshell. I don't really have anything more left on this slide, so I'm going to bring myself back up. Let me transition. There we go. So that's it. That's my talk that I have. It's kind of long-winded. I get it. It's probably, what is this? I think we've been recording for definitely over an hour here. I don't see my numbers anywhere, but Oh, there it is, about an hour and a half. Good grief. But that's basically it in a nutshell. If I'm going to do this in some sort of meetup group or some sort of talk that I'm going to do on a conference, I would definitely shorten a lot of some of the talking points and just kind of maybe show them. But I think that hopefully overall, I've presented to you the challenges that we see with static teams, alternatives to those static teams, enterprise organizational structure for teams that or task forces that can work within your organization and solve. There's so many pieces that actually get solved by doing this. I didn't even talk about human resources, but just bringing on, how do you acquire developers to bring into your development team, and that learning curve that new developers to the organization have to undergo, that can take months, if not years, depending upon the complexity of the project. But in this organizational structure, that's not even a problem. You just you just start including them into task forces, and they start to acquire the knowledge as they work with the different with the different task forces, right? So there's a lot of great things, and that's just one piece. The human resources is just one piece of this. There are so many benefits if we went to a task force based structure instead of the hierarchical, safe, Scrum kind of systems that are out there. This would just, I think, solve a lot of those problems. Anyway, I'm open to hearing your comments, your suggestions, your challenges. What did you think of the talk? What are some of the things that maybe you really enjoyed it? Maybe you found some things informative that you hadn't thought of before. Anyway, I would love to hear your comments and your notes and your questions. So please drop them in the comment section below. Once again, if you're looking to receive any sort of, if you're looking to have me kind of talk at one of your conferences, or if you want to maybe use Galvanize, the company I work for, to do some consultation within your organization and enterprise, feel free to reach out to me. There's ways to do that on my channel. Or you can just drop me a comment in the comment section and say, hey, can you please contact me? I've got some stuff I want to talk about an opportunity. You can certainly do that. I do a lot of I do a lot of work with large scale enterprises. So hopefully we can help you out as well. Anyway, if you have any questions, and again, any comments, concerns, that sort of thing, please, again, drop them in that comment section below, and I will be happy to respond to them. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye. I'd like to thank these members for joining the channel. Your contributions help keep this channel going. Thank you very much.